On May 29, 1889, the Kingston Daily News ran a story about a schooner called the Bavaria found aground near Galoo Island. The ship was nearly perfect, not a single crack in her hull. But there was no one on board, not a soul. And that's just one of the strange accidents that happened on Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario is the smallest of the Great Lakes compared to Lake Superior with its famous wrecks like the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Kamloops, or Lake Erie with its own share of unsettling stories. Ontario doesn't get much attention. But don't let its size fool you. Under that calm surface lies a massive graveyard where hundreds of ships rest in cold darkness, lost for reasons that are difficult to explain, if not outright impossible. Today we're talking about the shipwrecks of Lake Ontario, the ones the press largely ignored, the ones that look simple on paper until you dig just a little deeper. So let's dive down into the deepest waters of Ontario and listen to what this lake has been hiding. This is One Wave Away. Now let's go back to Halloween night 1780. The American Revolution was still very much alive. Battles were being fought, supply lines were being cut, and both sides were doing everything they could to control the inland waterways. For the British, that meant controlling the Great Lakes, and on Lake Ontario, their most powerful weapon was HMS Ontario. She wasn't just a warship, she was a statement. Built on Carlton Island from thick oak timber, she carried 22 guns and was rigged in what sailors called a snow configuration, a setup with a small auxiliary mast positioned just behind the main mast, which allowed the crew to manage the sails with more precision than a standard brig. She was only 6 months old when she met the lake for the last time. On the evening of October 31st, the skies over Niagara were clear enough. HMS Ontario set out with over 130 people on board, sailors, soldiers, women, children, and a number of American prisoners of war. It wasn't unusual to have civilians on a vessel like this. The lakes were how people moved, how supplies traveled, how the war was supplied and sustained. The crossing was supposed to be routine. What the crew couldn't have known was that a backdoor cold front was already forming to the northeast, moving in a direction that made it nearly impossible to predict using the tools and knowledge available at the time. There was no thunder, no lightning, no visible warning on the horizon. Just a slow, quiet shift in the wind that the men on watch might have noticed a little too late. Within hours, the temperature dropped sharply, winds picked up to somewhere between 30 and 40 knots, and the lake, which had looked perfectly manageable at dusk, became something else entirely. Try to imagine what it was like on that deck, a ship only 6 months out of the shipyard with a crew still learning her temperament, the kind of crew that hadn't yet developed the instinct for when she was about to do something unpredictable. The order would have come to shorten sail, reduce the canvas, catching the wind before it ripped the masts clean out. Sailors scrambling in the dark, the deck pitching under their feet, water coming over the sides in sheets, and somewhere in that chaos, one of the heavy 6-pounder cannons broke free from its lashings on the starboard side. It slid across the deck and slammed into the tiller, the wooden arm that controlled the rudder, jamming it hard to one side. With the tiller locked, the helmsman had no way to steer. The ship was at the mercy of the storm turning broadside to the waves, which is exactly the position you do not want to be in on a lake that's decided it's done with you. HMS Ontario went down fast, and she went down straight. By morning, the lake was calm again, and there was nothing, no wreckage, no bodies, no survivors. The most powerful British warship on Lake Ontario had simply ceased to exist. In the weeks that followed, a few pieces of debris washed ashore enough to confirm that something had happened, but nowhere near enough to tell the full story. The families of those 130 souls were left with almost nothing to hold on to. For the next 228 years, HMS Ontario stayed exactly where the lake had put her. Shipwreck hunters searched for her, theorized about her, and came up empty. She had become something of a holy grail for anyone serious about Great Lakes history. Then, in 2008, two divers named Jim Kennard and Dan Scoville picked up something unusual on their sonar at a depth of around 500 feet. What they found didn't look like a wreck. It looked like a ship that had simply decided to park on the bottom of the lake and wait. HMS Ontario was sitting upright, perfectly intact, with both masts still standing nearly 65 feet tall. The ROV footage showed the ornately carved scroll at her bow, the officers' quarter galleries at her stern-even window glass still sitting in its frames. Zebra mussels had colonized most of the hull, as they do with everything down there, but the ship's bronze bell was still bright and clean, because bronze, as it turns out, is naturally antimicrobial. The mussels couldn't get a grip on it. 228 years underwater, and that bell still looked like someone had just polished it. The cannon that likely caused the sinking was still there too, jammed against the tiller, exactly where investigators had theorized it would be. The lake had preserved the evidence along with everything else. HMS Ontario is now legally recognized as a war grave under both Canadian and British law, which means no one is allowed to touch her, remove anything from her, or disturb the site in any way. 130 people went down with that ship, including women and children who had no stake in the war being fought around them. The law says you leave it alone, and honestly, that feels right. Some places deserve to stay exactly as they are. If you've spent any time around maritime history, you've probably heard of the Mary Celeste, the brigantine found adrift in the Atlantic in 1872. Her crew vanished without a trace, a half-eaten meal still on the table, cargo untouched, not a single sign of struggle or panic. Nobody has ever fully explained what happened to the people on board. Well, Lake Ontario has its own version of that story, and in some ways, it's worse. On the morning of May 28, 1889, a barge called the Bavaria broke loose from her towline in the middle of a violent storm on Lake Ontario. By the time rescuers caught up with her, stranded on Galoo Island, sitting upright, barely a scratch on her, the 8 men who had been sailing her were gone, all of them. The people who boarded her described the experience as deeply unsettling, not because of what they found, but because of how ordinary everything looked. In the galley, a can of tomatoes had been opened but never touched, sitting on the table right where someone had left it. In the oven, a pan of bread dough had risen, overflowed the edges of the pan, and hardened there because the fire had gone out long before anyone came back to check on it. The captain's cabin was dry-tidy and completely undisturbed. His certificate and his cash box were still sitting on the shelf where he always kept them. The life preservers were still on deck. 4 spare oars were still on deck. Everything was exactly where it should be, which was precisely what made it so strange. The Bavaria was a pine timber barge, and that matters. alpine floats. Experienced lake sailors knew this. A timber-loaded barge was about as close to unsinkable as you could get on fresh water. The investigation that followed would conclude pretty bluntly that if the crew had simply stayed on board, they almost certainly would have survived. The Bavaria drifted safely to shore on her own. She didn't need saving, the men did. So why did they leave? The most credible theory comes from Captain Malone of the steam barge Calvin, which had been towing the Bavaria when the tow line snapped. He reported seeing the crew gathered at the stern, pulling their yawl boat around to the leeward side of the vessel. His best guess, and the guess of several other witnesses, was that Captain Marshall had been swept overboard while working on deck, and the rest of the crew launched the yawl to go after him. A split-second decision made in the middle of a gale by men who weren't willing to leave their captain in the water. James Burlingham, the lighthouse keeper at Point Peter, watched the whole thing from shore. He saw the yawl pull away from the Bavaria with 5 or 6 men on board, rowing hard toward land. They were making progress until a squall hit them. When the wind died down, the yawl was upside down. 2 or 3 men were clinging to the hull. Others had grabbed onto floating timber. 2 men on one log, 1 man on another, a 4th spotted further down the lake, still holding on. Burlingham ran to telegraph for help from Kingston. The crew of the steamer Tecumseh passed the scene not long after. One of them spotted a man, dark hair, dark beard, sitting on the bottom of the overturned yawl. The man raised his arm and then let it drop, the way you do when you have almost nothing left. The captain of the Tecumseh said it was too bad to pass him, but turning a steamer in seas like that with barges in tow wasn't something any reasonable person could do, so they kept going. And the man on the upturned hull, whoever he was, slipped out of sight. No bodies were ever officially recovered. The investigation closed. The Bavaria was repaired and put back into service because that's what you did with a perfectly good barge. The men who had sailed her were just gone, and Lake Ontario moved on without much ceremony. For years, the loss of the Bavaria was filed away as a tragic but explainable accident, experienced sailors making a fatal judgment call in a bad storm. A reasonable conclusion. Except that when you look at a map and find exactly where the Bavaria went down, the explanation starts to feel a little less satisfying. The wreck happened in a stretch of water between Wolfe Island, Point Peter, and Mexico Bay, a region that researchers and maritime historians have come to call the Marysburgh Vortex. More than 270 shipwrecks lie in this area. 40 aircraft have gone down here. The density of accidents per square mile reportedly exceeds that of the Bermuda Triangle, which is a sentence that should give anyone pause. The leading geological explanation centers on a formation called Charity Shoal, a nearly perfectly circular structure sitting at about 25 feet below the surface, believed to be the remnant of a meteorite impact crater, roughly 460 million years old. The iron-rich minerals concentrated in that crater generate measurable magnetic anomalies. Compasses passing over the area have been documented deflecting anywhere from 20 to 27 degrees off true north. In fog, or at night, or in the middle of a gale, that kind of deviation isn't a minor inconvenience. It's the difference between knowing where you are and having absolutely no idea. Did magnetic interference play any role in what happened to the Bavaria and her crew? Probably not directly. They knew roughly where they were, and the storm knot navigation was what finished them. But it does reframe the question a little, because the Bavaria wasn't the first vessel to come apart in those waters, and she certainly wasn't the last. The lake collected ships in that particular stretch with a consistency that goes a bit beyond bad luck, and Charity Shoal has been sitting there quietly warping compasses for 460 million years, long before any of us started building things and sailing them into its neighborhood. Not every story Lake Ontario holds is a mystery. Some of them are just grief, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of official maritime records and buried under decades of silence. The story of the George A. Marsh is one of those. By 1917, the George A. Marsh was 25 years old, which in wooden schooner years is the maritime equivalent of your grandfather's truck that everyone keeps patching up because replacing it feels wrong. She had been built in Muskegon, Michigan, changed hands a few times, picked up Canadian registry in 1914, and spent her later years doing the unglamorous work that steam had left behind, hauling coal feldspar, whatever cargo nobody else wanted to bother with. Her registered tonnage was 220. On August 8th, her captain, John Wesley Smith, had secured a contract with the Sowards Coal Company to deliver a load of coal to Rockwood Hospital in Kingston. Their usual carrier wasn't available, and Captain Smith wasn't about to pass up the money. So he loaded her up. 450 tons of coal went into her holds, more than double her registered capacity. The old timbers creaked and settled under the weight the way they always did, and nobody wrote that part down anywhere official. What makes this particular voyage different from 100 other overloaded cargo runs on the Great Lakes is who else was on board. Captain Smith's second wife and 5 of their 7 children had come along for the trip. Neil McClellan, one of the deckhands, had been given permission to bring his wife, their 18-month-old baby, and a nephew. The captain's brother, William Smith, was there too. In total, 13 people were on that vessel when she left Oswego, New York, on what was described as a sunny morning, with a nice fresh breeze out of the southwest, the kind of day that makes you think the lake is your friend. The lake had other ideas. The storm came fast, the way Lake Ontario storms tend to, not gradually building on the horizon, giving you time to think, but arriving like it had somewhere to be. The waves climbed, the old hull, already straining under twice the weight she was built to carry, began losing the argument. Her seams opened. Water poured in faster than the pumps could handle it, and somewhere in the darkness, off the Amherst Island shoreline, the George A. Marsh went under upright, fast within sight of the Kingston harbor she'd been heading for. The crew managed to cut loose the yawl from the stern davits. The second lifeboat, lashed to the port side near the bow, never made it off the deck. In the chaos of a sinking ship at night in mountainous seas with children on board, there simply wasn't time. William Smith and Neil McClellan got into the yawl. McClellan had his baby in his arms. One of the Marshall children accounts don't record which one managed to reach the yawl and grab hold of the side. Both men tried to pull the child in. The waves were too high, the boat too small, the chaos too complete. The child held on for as long as a child can hold on to something in cold water in the dark, and then didn't. That detail appears in the historical record in one quiet sentence, and it lands like a stone every time. McClellan kept his baby pressed against him through the hours it took the yawl to reach Amherst Island. He had wrapped himself around the child the way parents do when they've decided that their own body is going to be enough. It wasn't. By the time the yawl touched shore, the 18-month-old had been dead for some time, taken by hypothermia somewhere out there on the black water in his father's arms, while his father was still alive and trying. Of the 13 people who had left Oswego that morning, 11 did not make it. The captain's wife, 5 children, Mrs. McClellan, her baby, the nephew, the deckhand George Cousins. Some of their bodies washed ashore in the days that followed. Some of them are still down there beside the wreck, 80 feet under Lake Ontario. The next morning, all that marked the spot was the tops of her 3 masts breaking the surface. They were eventually pulled out to avoid being a navigation hazard, and the George A. Marsh was left where she was forgotten for nearly 50 years. Now, here is the part of this story that took almost 90 years to come out. Captain John Wesley Smith, the man whose name was on the registration, whose decision it was to load 450 tons onto a 220-ton vessel whose wife and children went down with that ship, was not on board the day she sank. He had sent his 65-year-old mate William Watkins in his place. After the disaster, rather than face authorities over the overloading and his absence, Captain Smith quietly crossed the border and disappeared into the United States. He settled in Harrah, Oklahoma, and lived out the rest of his life there in obscurity. His own family believed he had gone down with the George A. Marsh. For decades, that was simply the accepted version of events, that John Wesley Smith had perished alongside his wife and children, and the whole tragic chapter was closed. It wasn't until 2006, when a woman named Eileen Wessel wrote a letter to a maritime history website, that the truth finally surfaced. She had known the family. She knew he hadn't been on that ship. She knew where he was buried. The George A. Marsh was located in 2013 by, you may recognize the name by now, Jim Kennard, sitting upright on the bottom in 80 feet of water, largely intact. Divers today can still see the wheel, the anchor winch, the coal still sitting in her holds. It is by all accounts a remarkably well-preserved wreck. A time capsule of a ship that had no business being as loaded as she was on the day she went under, carrying people who had no reason to be there, skippered by a man who had decided for whatever reason that he had somewhere else to be. Not every story Lake Ontario tells ends in loss. Every so often, the lake lets someone go, and when it does, the circumstances tend to be strange enough that you find yourself wondering whether luck is really the right word for it. The Robaval was a steel-hulled steamer built in Toronto in 1907 and originally designed for saltwater trade. By 1916, she was working the Great Lakes, and in late September of that year, she set out from Cape Vincent, bound for Oswego, carrying 248,000 board feet of pine timber, destined for the Diamond Match Company, the kind of cargo that gets turned into matchsticks and matchboxes, which is a fairly unremarkable end for a tree, but there you go. The problem with carrying that much timber on deck is the same problem that doomed the George A. Marsh the year before. All that wood stacked high above the waterline acts less like cargo and more like a sail. When the northwest wind picked up past 30 miles an hour, the Robaval began to roll in a way that her crew would have recognized as trouble. The waves were running over 2 meters, not catastrophic on their own, but combined with the instability of the deck load, the ship was fighting to stay upright with every swell. Then the rogue wave hit. A single massive wall of water struck the starboard side, throwing a significant portion of the deck load into the lake. Before the crew could process what had just happened, a second wave followed and the remaining timber shifted violently aft, smashing into the rear cabin structure and destroying it entirely. The Robaval was mortally wounded in the space of about 30 seconds. What happened next is one of the more haunting details in Lake Ontario's maritime record. As the ship began to sink slowly, at first held partially upright by the 150,000 board feet of dry spruce still in her hold, which was creating enough buoyancy to keep her from going under immediately, a 26-year-old deckhand named Theodore Leroy appeared at the porthole of the forward cabin. He was trapped. The timber that had shifted during the sinking had blocked the only exit from that compartment, and there was nothing anyone on the outside could do about it. The survivors later described seeing his eyes through the glass, wide desperate before the ship finally took him down. The Robaval stood nearly upright on the surface for hours, propped up by her own cargo, long enough that a vessel 7 miles away, the Glen Allen, saw sunlight glinting off the hull and assumed it was just a reflection off cabin windows. Nobody went to investigate. 4 people ended up in the water: Captain Peter Elash, 68 years old, First Mate Joseph Parisien, 65, a 21-year-old fireman named Marcel Messenau, and the ship's cook, Delia Patent, 30 years old, who had been thrown into the lake when the ship went over. Captain Elik, 68 years old, to be clear, in cold lake water in late September, jumped in after her, grabbed her by the hair, and pulled her onto a floating timber. That detail deserves a moment. The man was 68. Parisien had been working to lash pieces of floating timber together into a makeshift raft, and the 4 of them managed to haul themselves onto it. Around them, the surface of the lake was covered in floating pine in every direction, the entire cargo of the Robaval now scattered across the water. It was an eerie landscape, thousands of logs drifting quietly in the swell, with 4 people clinging to a pile of them in the middle, hoping that someone would notice the difference between a field of floating timber and a field of floating timber with people on it. That night, the wind shifted and began pushing the raft away from shore rather than toward it. By morning, they were further out in the lake than they had been the night before, which is not the direction you want to be going after 20+ hours on a wooden raft in late September. The cold was significant. The situation was objectively not good. And then the birds came. A flock of birds flew in and landed on the debris field surrounding the raft, on the logs, on the floating wood, settling across the wreckage in a way that made the whole area suddenly visibly distinct from the empty lake around it. The crew of the big sandy Coast Guard station saw the birds, found the concentration unusual enough to investigate, and discovered 4 people still alive after 22 hours on the water. 7 of the Robaval's crew survived in total, the 4 on the raft, and 3 others who had made it into a damaged lifeboat. 2 did not: Theodore Leroy, still in the forward cabin when she went down, and Henry Sagan, who had made it up to the deck, only to be struck by falling timber in the final moments. 2 men, and between them a story that sits on either end of the spectrum of how badly things can go in the space of a few seconds. The Robaval itself vanished entirely from the historical record after that no wreck located a no confirmed position, just a ship that sank and stayed gone for 97 years. It wasn't until October 2013, on the very last day of the search season before the marinas closed for winter, that Jim Kennard and his team decided to make one final pass across an unexplored stretch of open water. They called it a Hail Mary search. 90 minutes into the survey pattern, the sonar picked up the Robaval. She sits upright on the bottom off the coast of Oswego. The superstructure, the cabin, the wheelhouse, everything above the main deck is gone, torn away during the sinking. The bow still has its anchor windlass in place, The stern, with its distinctive elliptical shape, still has its two square bollards exactly where they were in 1916. The starboard side has collapsed inward. The port side is buried almost to the rail in silt. The mast snapped and came to rest draped across the port railing, which is the kind of detail that makes wreck divers quietly satisfied and everyone else mildly unsettled. The dry spruce that kept her afloat for so long is long gone. Only the steel remains and the shape of what she was. So why does Lake Ontario keep doing this? Why does a body of water that looks on a calm day like nothing more than a very large and inconveniently placed puddle have a maritime graveyard stretching across its entire floor? The sailors who worked these lakes had a name for it, the Witch of November. That's what they called the storms that form when Arctic air comes rolling down from Canada and collides with a lake surface that's still holding on to the warmth of summer. The temperature difference creates something that behaves less like a weather system and more like a detonation, fast, violent, and with very little warning. The George A. Marsh met her. The Robaval met her. So did the HMS Ontario on a Halloween night 245 years ago. But the weather alone doesn't explain all of it. The ships we talked about today weren't just victims of bad storms. They were victims of overloaded holds of captains who weren't where they should have been, of a time when the economic pressure to move cargo outweighed the common sense to not put 200 extra tons of coal into a vessel that couldn't handle it. The lake was the final word, but the decisions that led people there were made on dry land in offices by people who weren't going to be on the water when things went wrong. What keeps these stories from disappearing entirely is the work of people like Jim Kennard divers and researchers who spend their seasons out on the water with sonar equipment and ROVs looking for ships that have been missing for decades or centuries. They find them, they document them, and they leave them exactly as they found them. No souvenirs, no salvage, just the record and the acknowledgement that someone was there and that it mattered. The next time you're standing at the edge of Lake Ontario on a quiet day, looking out at water that seems like it couldn't possibly be hiding anything, remember that somewhere beneath that flat grey surface, the HMS Ontario is still standing upright with her masts extended, the George A. Marsh still has coal in her holds, and the Bavaria is still out there with questions attached to her that nobody has fully answered. The lake doesn't give up its stories easily. It just keeps them quietly until someone comes looking. This has been One Wave Away. We'll see you on the water.